Welcome to the Religious Treehouse. I'm Matthew.
And I'm Jody.
Oh, Jody, how are you doing today?
Matthew, it is Love Island season once again,
Mm.
US and UK. All the hot people are in a pool and making out with each other. So I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Oh, does Love Island, do they film them at the same time? I feel like that's something that they would like spread out across the year to like get.
Absolutely not.
No, no, no. Of course not.
I think Australia might happen at a different time, but UK and US, like we're a day behind because it takes time to hit the streaming, but Love Island USA streams right to Peacock.
Of course.
Yeah.
Fascinating. I'm so excited for you. I'm glad that you're living your best life here.
I really am. We're about to start voting tonight. Oh, it's gonna get hectic. What have you been up to?
I I've been doing reading, and you have your joys and I have mine.
That is
So
true.
I've been doing great lately. I just started this like new book by Stephen Prothero called like Religious Literacy. It's like a
Mm,
super easy read, but it's a fantastic, amazing read. That's like outlines so much of like what my goals are for this whole project that we're doing.
mm.
But I also realized that my undergrad professor just like used this entire book for like the first two sessions of every class I've ever took with him. And I'm like, oh, this is why I'm resonating with this book so much. It's because like this is how I was trained.
Yeah.
Because there's just like quotes verbatim from like what I've learned from like my undergrad classes.
Mm.
And it's so funny to me. I'm like, this would have been so good to read like 4 years ago, but we're fine.
The familiar is comforting.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's comforting, and also I'm like, I trust this because this
Yeah.
is how I've been trained. But it's
Amen.
great. Read Stephen Prothero's book, Religious Literacy. Fantastic.
Fantastic. I'm excited. Let's get into it.
Yeah, let's get into it. Today, we're doing a more conceptual topic instead of just like diving into a Bible story. We're talking about the canonization of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. I'm so excited for this conversation. We're not going to be able to like, get into any of the like little nitty-gritty details, but I think this will be a great overarching, 3,000 foot view of what's going on with the canonization of the Hebrew Bible. And then hopefully sometime later we'll talk about the canonization of the New Testament, but that's not nearly as much fun.
When I think of the word canon, I think of TV shows and other books and projects. And I just never really thought about the Bible canon. And I know
Oh,
that's probably the origin of canon, but I just never applied it to the Bible till we started talking.
canon is either a Greek or Latin term. It comes from one
Okay.
of those. I want to say Greek, but I could be wrong there.
Yeah.
And it literally means reed or like measuring stick. So it's
Okay.
like what you could like measure something up against.
Okay.
So I think it's just like how people talk. I don't know if it's like related to the Bible or anything.
Yeah.
When I think of canon outside of like biblical canon, I usually
Mm.
think of like art history. You
Ah,
have like the art history canon of people who are in it and who aren't, which
mhm.
is until recently just been a whole bunch of old white guys.
Mm.
And then people are like, hey, what if we rethink this canon thing and try to like insert women and people of color into the canon? And now there's this whole debate about do we even need a canon? What's that whole debacle? But that's a whole other conversation that has nothing to do with what we're talking about today.
But I think it kind of does because my next question is what is the importance of canon? Does canon hold importance or does it only hold as much as you allow it to have?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess. I think first to like define canon in the
Yeah.
topic of the Bible, we can kind of understand it as like this creation of a list, usually exclusive,
Hmm.
where nothing can be added or removed. In the case of this conversation, biblical books.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about the canonization of books in the Bible, we're talking about what groups created these lists of books that were authoritative
Hmm.
in their religious trajectory.
Yeah.
And a lot of times when we think of canon, we think of a closed canon in which nothing can be added or removed.
Hmm.
And we'll get to that. But I think for the majority part of this conversation that we're having, when we talk about canon, we can kind of talk about it as a more flimsy thing until we get to the end and we're like, this is the closed canon
Okay.
that has generally been decided.
Yeah.
And then maybe even in that whole realm of thinking, scripture is a
Mm.
better word instead of canon.
Yeah.
Because when we think of canon, we think of a closed canon,
Mm.
whereas scripture could be a term that's for a potentially open-ended set of texts that is authoritative and important for some reason or another.
Yeah.
But they hold importance because if you are part of a group that has a shared set of ideas or morals or literature or stories, it is important that you know what stories that you're sharing and talking about. So like if we're talking about like the US government and politics and that,
Mm.
there's a canon of authoritative documents, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, et cetera, that are canon in the law, theoretically. But
Imagine being like, the Bill of Rights is no longer canon. That'd be crazy.
yeah, so because we as Americans have an idea of what is authoritative and we share that idea, that's why it's important. If someone were just to like walk up and be like, hey, actually as an American we need to like follow the Magna Carta, we'd be like, hold up, that doesn't really apply to us. We're not following the same set of rules, the same shared history. So to have a religious group to agree on a same shared history makes the conversations make a lot more sense, makes it a whole lot easier for us to be like, yeah, you're one of us, you're not one of
Okay.
us, yada yada.
Yeah. A unifying item
Yeah,
of sort.
yeah, it creates a shared history that you can easily refer back to without having to defend yourself every time of saying this is something that I deem authoritative.
Okay. But then people disagree upon the interpretation of that
Yeah,
canon.
and that's a whole other that's a whole other thing. And you also get debates on what is in or outside the canon. That's what a big part of the Reformation was. We'll
Mm.
talk about that at some point. When the Reformation was happening, Martin Luther and all his buddies were like, "Hey, this apocrypha stuff, not really for me. Thank you."
Mm.
And so that's why we get Protestant canons not having a lot of the apocryphal or deuterocanonical texts, and
Mm.
then Catholic and Orthodox churches are like, "Yeah, for sure, we love these guys."
Deviating from something so much older than you. What a bold move, Martin Luther. What a bold move. Okay. Wow. So canon, it's important. It can create a butterfly effect on how people are impacted later. Um, does it close? Is this a closed canon? Do you think anyone could add anything at
I
this
mean,
point?
anyone could, whether or not it would be accepted by the majority of like Christians, for example.
Yeah.
Like you could add a text if you want. Like in like there have been attempts, maybe not official attempts, but I
Mm.
think of like the Trump Bible that adds like
Mm.
the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and stuff in that
Mm.
Bible
Yeah.
by putting those documents next to biblical documents. It adds or it intends to add a sense of authority to those documents, not to maybe make them scriptural per se, but
Yeah.
it definitely is pointing more so in that direction. So
Yeah.
to say that it's for sure done a closed canon that, you know, theoretically, according to, historical church doctrine and stuff, yeah, the canon's closed.
Yeah.
But in lived practice, there's going to be conversations, there's going to be debates. If you would have asked this question in the 1400s, it'd been like, oh yeah, for sure,
Yeah.
these are our books, what
Yeah.
yada yada yada. And then Martin Luther comes along and says, you know, Tobit, not a big fan. Who needs Tobit?
Who needs Topic? Okay. All right. So we don't know what the future holds. Great. That's
I mean,
terrifying.
it it would be a surprise if all of a sudden, the Catholic Church was like, "Hey guys, we're gonna add this to the Bible." That would be like, million to one odds. But theoretically, not impossible.
Okay. So there's always a chance.
There's always a chance. There's
Gospel of
always a
Mary,
chance
hear
for,
that? There's always
yeah.
a chance.
And this is why you should always write stuff so that you have a chance to maybe be included in the Bible.
Oh, yeah. The people who wrote stuff, those fun people. Let's talk about so these writers,
Mhm.
like I want to like conceptualize real quick. The
Okay.
people who wrote this, like, do you think they wrote this with the intention of it being authoritative? Like, right, yeah?
You mean
Like
the Bible? Who wrote the
like
Bible?
books, just the books? Or were
The
they just
books
writing for writing's sake?
like in the Bible?
Yeah, like were they just artists?
Yeah, I think, and for the sake of this conversation, I think we'll stick to the Old Testament Hebrew
Yeah.
Bible, because I think the answer is different for the New Testament.
Hmm.
But I think by and large, uh, the Old Testament authors wrote purposefully, and it was expected that their work was to be taken as important. That's not to say that they expected to be included into the canon per se, because I think the canon is an anachronistic term,
Hmm.
and there was no like real canon until first few centuries of the Common Era, which we'll talk about
Yeah.
that as we get into it. But I think as and much of my research for this episode is based on John Barton's A History of the Bible as a
Hmm.
way to help me like organize my thoughts other than like creating this all by myself. So read John Barton's History of the Bible, specifically chapter 9, if you want to get like, you know, more of these words that are similar. Great resource. Speaking of great resources, read that entire book. It's a fantastic resource. Um, but one thing that he claims is that, and this is a quote from him, he says, I am doubtful of a model in which material was written but became canonical only centuries later. Little of the Old Testament is occasional literature. Most of it seems designed for official recognition and probably received it almost at once, implying that people who wrote books in the Old Testament did so in an official and important matter for the most part. And it makes sense for them to receive some form of authoritative, perhaps even scriptural status very quickly.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Unlike the first time I heard it.
But yeah, do you want to kind of get into it and talk
Yeah.
about like how we're figuring out what is the Hebrew Bible canon?
Who should I start with my first question? Who wrote it? Who decided it was canon?
Yeah. Um,
Who-
we'll get into that. I think this is going to be a very disappointing episode in which there's no direct answer to that. Uh, but more so it kind of evolved over time and was finalized just kind of, as it happens to be.
No direct answer for the canonization of ancient literature?
but
Shocking.
but I mean, this is different than the New Testament. When we talk about the New Testament,
Yeah.
eventually there is a bit more, not as neat as one would hope to be, but there is a bit more neatness to this answer with when it comes to the New Testament.
Well, people were recording more history around then.
I mean, not necessarily.
Really? Well,
Yeah,
I
I
can think
mean,
of one dude.
well, the New Testament or the most scholars, and we'll get more into this. Most scholars usually date the official canonization
Mhm.
of the Old Testament to be around the second century CE,
Okay.
and then once you get into the fourth, fifth, sixth centuries CE, that's when you get the New Testament really finalized.
Okay.
So you know, I don't think thinking of history being recorded in different amounts impacted when canonization happened. I don't think that's a important factor.
Well, I meant more in determining the how the canonization took place and
Mm-hmm.
like the little facts and stuff because I don't we're on the Old Testament. Let's talk Old Testament.
For sure. Um, so what we have is some early Christian sources kind of being like, hey, Jews have an Old Testament
Yeah.
or the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, they do.
What are their books? How do we figure that out? And so we get our good friend Josephus,
Ugh.
for example, and he says there's 22 books that contain the record of all time, which doesn't exactly fit our arrangement. He says there's 22 books as
We got
opposed
24.
yeah, as opposed to the traditionally counted 24. That could be because he's kind of conflating Jeremiah and Lamentations together, as well as Judges and Ruth together. So if he's doing that, that would be the 22 books, which would make sense for him to want there to be 22 books, because that
Mm.
corresponds to one letter per, or one book per letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So you get 22
Nice.
as a number that you see every once in a while, despite most countings being 24. And then if you ask like other traditions,
Mm.
it'll be like I think Christian traditions will have 30 or 40 or something because they count each of the minor prophets as one book each, as opposed to the book of the 12 being a single book. So counting books is difficult.
Yeah.
It's hard. Where does one book start, one book end? Is the book of First and Second Samuel one book or two books? Is the book of Kings one book or two book? Are the books of First and Second Samuel and the books of First and Second Kings one book or two books or four books? All of these are questions that people have asked and no one has answered.
Great.
But yeah, so Josephus, our good friend Josephus from the end of the first century, says
Hmm.
22 books, and we say, yeah, that's about right for what we knew. And then we have Melito, Bishop of Sardis, tried
Hmm.
to establish what happens there, and he made a list, but it doesn't mention Nehemiah, Lamentations, or Esther. Now, Nehemiah and Lamentations could be explained away as Nehemiah being conflated with Ezra and Jeremiah being conflated with Lamentations. Uh,
Hmm.
and then everything there, for the most part, makes sense, except for Leviticus and Numbers being switched around for some reason.
Yeah.
And
And
then
Esther
Origin,
was,
Esther. Hey, Esther, we're just happy that Esther's in the canon because we love Esther despite the hardships that she went through to get in there.
that is accepting too little for women. Okay. We've got to be able to scrounge up something else to add. We must.
Yeah, and because Esther's an interesting book, and we'll get into the details of Esther in a bit, but the fact that Esther isn't quoted in the New Testament by any of the New Testament authors, the fact that Esther isn't found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, like it implies that Esther is for sure on the edge. It's on the periphery of what may or may not be considered canon, just like Song of Songs, just like Kohelet. These are all books that are like maybe they didn't make it into the Bible, but eventually they did. So
Well, could we look at Esther as an early example of waves of feminism? I don't know if it's on the edge and they got
I
near the end and they were like, we just got to include the ladies.
sure, but then you have stories of like Susanna that didn't make
And maybe that should be up for discussion.
it. Yeah, I mean, Susanna stayed in the apocrypha. Who knows? But yeah, it's fun. It's exciting. There's a lot happening. But I think the main thing that is important to know here is there wasn't a like council or anything that was like, yes, this is now the books in the Hebrew Bible. We have it here. There are some that will say the Council of Jamnia or Yavne,
Yeah.
uh, which happened in 90 CE, and they said, "Oh, alas, this is the books in the Hebrew Bible." A bunch of rabbis got together and decided the books of the Hebrew Bible. That
Yeah.
was a idea popular in the late 1900s.
Mhm.
More recent scholarship has been like, nah, that is too neat, too tidy, doesn't make much sense. It's a much more organic process that just kind of happened as it goes.
Let's talk about the process because there must have been like different canons floating around like
Mhm.
amongst the different Hebrew communities.
Yeah. Well, I think canon is, as I mentioned, an anachronistic term,
Mhm.
and it's important. I think much more accurate.
Traditions.
Right, right. There's a lot more traditions that have authoritative books
Yeah.
that they used. So we have the
Yes.
Samaritans, and they exclusively had and have only used the Pentateuch, the
Mhm.
Torah, the first five books of the Bible, and that's their
Okay.
entire Bible. That's the
Okay.
entirety of what they're considered to be scriptural, and now that's what their canon is.
Yeah.
And then we have things like the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran that we don't know for sure what they considered scripture, what for sure they didn't consider scripture, but they have a
Mhm.
lot of books in there that aren't considered scripture. That doesn't necessarily mean that they were in their quote unquote canon, but it
Mhm.
doesn't. But we need to also include that as like, hey, they potentially saw that as canonical. Same thing with the New Testament authors. For the most part, they quote every book in the Hebrew Bible except for I think Song of Songs and Esther.
Mm.
So we can get a hint that the New Testament authors, as that was a long range of a time that took place over time and place,
Mhm.
didn't consider or maybe perhaps didn't include those books as scriptural. Maybe they did, but they also included other books
Mhm.
that, or they quoted other books that seemed to be scriptural of some or of some import, but didn't entirely make it into the Hebrew Bible canon as we know it now. We'll
Okay.
talk more about that later. But yeah, we also see like different levels of importance. We see this today too. I call it the canon within the canon of books that are canonical that are used more and more than the other books. So you'll see a lot of Christians use Genesis and Isaiah in the New Testament and Psalms and Proverbs a whole lot more than you'll see them use Obadiah or Jude or whatever. So there's a canon within the canon of canonical books that groups use more often than other books in their
Yeah.
canon. So we see like Qumran. they seem to have a real good big emphasis on Habakkuk. We have like commentaries and stuff on Habakkuk and like more copies of Habakkuk than we do or than we would expect. And
Mhm.
so it seems like they really placed a high, reverence towards Habakkuk.
Yeah.
So I think that's another thing that we have to consider. What is the canon within the canon?
Yeah.
What is the canon? And how does that all play out in our understanding of their understanding of religion?
Yes. Okay.
Cool. All right. Let's move on to some specific questions,
Yes.
particularly Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes.
Yeah, what's up with them? Matthew had me do some homework and I did some research, and people just could not shut up about Ecclesiastes. So what's their beef?
Yeah, so by the end of the first century of the Common Era, there was
Hmm.
still some debate among rabbinic authorities among primarily Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. And Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes, I think, are two really interesting ones. We get things in the Mishnah that talks about defiling the hands. And so counterintuitively, touching scripture seems to leave one's hands unclean. So you
Hmm.
touch scripture, it makes your hands unclean, it defiles your hands. So the debate is
That
on whether,
what?
yeah, it's counterintuitive. Touch the
Yeah.
scripture makes your hands unclean. And maybe it's like a deterrent for people to like irreverently touch holy text and stuff. So like, hey, if you touch this text, it makes your hands unclean. So don't touch these texts, or else you'll be ritually impure for however long.
I mean, if you take touch in like a harmful way, like don't harmfully touch these things, it'd be like saying don't burn books.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, but it's like saying, hey, this is like say you have an important library in your home,
Yes.
or let's see, let's do a better example. You have a fancy piece of art in your
Mhm.
home. It's such a fancy piece of art. It was made by Rembrandt, and you have a bunch of kids over, and you say,
Mm.
"Hey, you can't touch that piece of artwork because if you do touch it, you'll be really, really, really dirty."
Okay.
And so we say, "Hey, if you touch that, it'll make you dirty, and
Mm.
therefore you'll have to go take a bath if you touch it."
It's like when Connor and I go to the luxury stores at this really fancy mall near us, like Prada, Chanel, and
Mhm.
I make him hold his hands behind his back
Yeah,
because I'm like, if you touch anything, you will become suspicious.
right, right. Um,
Defiling the hands. I get it now.
Yeah.
I'm
So
with
that's
you.
a theory. Like we don't know for
Yeah.
sure. That's the theory that makes the most sense out of why touching Holy Scripture would defile your hands.
Okay. All right. I'm there. I'm with you.
So most scholars see defiling the hands as kind of a euphemism for the text being canonical or like being established as Scripture. If it
Okay.
defiles
It defiles your
if it
hands.
defiles your hands, it's Scripture.
Okay.
Uh,
Which means it's
and
authoritative and should be a part of the canon.
right, right. Um, but the question in the rabbinic literature
Mm.
is whether or not Kohelet or Song of Songs defile your hands. And so while some scholars see that as saying as a debate between that being canonical or not, but that being scripture or not, a minority of scholars, and I'm fairly convinced of this as well, I'm on the minority here, see it not as it being canonical, but as like a normal characteristic for books in the Bible. A book
Mm.
in the Bible defiles your hands. A
Okay.
canonical book defiles your hands. And so the question of why Kohelet or Song of Songs being able to defile your hands must have some other reason. And it's not because they're may not be in the Bible, but there's another characteristic that, despite them being in the Bible, is up for debate on whether or not they defile your hands. And
And
so
what is that?
the argument there is that they don't have the divine name. The book of
Oh,
Ecclesiastes and the book of Song of Songs don't have the divine name in there. So what some scholars have argued is because they don't have the divine name in there, that's why there's debate on whether or not it defiles the hands or not.
hmm. Okay.
So it's not so much a question of is this scriptural or not. It's even though this is scriptural, does it defile the hands like all the other scripture does?
Okay. So it defiles the hands because it has the divine name
Mm-hmm.
inside of it. You do not want to touch it because it is therefore then divine and it must be protected,
Mhm.
like, is one thing. But also to touch the divine is to become defiled because you are what, not worthy of the divine?
Yeah, I mean,
Or,
there's a reverence for the divine name. This is why you don't say the divine name out loud, or if you see it written and you're reading it, you say Adonai
yeah.
instead of the tetragrammaton.
Mhm.
Uh, so like having, and this is why you don't throw away pieces of paper that have the divine name written on it. There's specific ritual actions that you do with biblical texts
Mhm.
to like repair it and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
there's a high reverence for the divine name, and thus the argument there is that's what's making it defile the hands, perhaps.
I am going to make an equivalence so we can have Connor out cut out if we need to. Um, because it reminds me of Muslims. You don't depict
Mhm.
who was it again?
Muhammad.
Yes, like the divineness. I don't know. It just has a similarity
Mhm.
to me. I don't know if that's an unfair parallel to make.
Yeah, no, I think there is a slight parallel to it for sure. I think there is a difference
Hmm.
that should be noted
Yeah,
where I think Jews would see the divine name being reference to God,
yeah,
whereas Muhammad isn't seen in a divine
no,
figure per se, more of
yeah.
a prophet. But but yeah, there could be a parallel there.
But the logic in which not to do those specific things, like taking the Lord's name in vain. I don't know,
Yeah.
just things like that. Just another thing that is
Mhm.
a common attitude
Mhm.
or within that culture and they follow it. And
Yeah.
that's just the way it is. But using that cultural clue, that context is useful in determining what is canon because
Mhm.
whatever defiles the hands is then scripture. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm with
So
you.
yeah, there's a few ways to look at it for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's such a fun, like anytime you learn about the canonization of the Hebrew
Mm,
Bible, you'll come across this term of defiling the hands because I
yeah.
think it's just such a fun and like quirky little bit of rabbinic literature that
Yeah.
you have to be like, oh yeah, what's going on there? Okay, cool. So some early stages of
Mm,
the formation of the Hebrew Bible.
hit me.
It was usually thought that there was kind of a three-part creation of the Hebrew Bible. The
Mm,
first off being the Torah,
yeah.
the first five books of the Bible.
Yes.
That was
Pentateuch.
considered, yeah, that was considered holy by the time of Ezra, which is like the fifth century BCE, and that's when the Samaritans considered that their entire canon, and then the rest of the Bible came in together after that. So after um, that was written, then the prophets were generally written, as this theory goes, and that was probably completed sometime before Daniel was written. So Daniel
Mm,
was written around the end of the beginning of the second century BCE, and much of Daniel implies that it should be seen as prophetic literature of some
yeah.
sort,
Mm,
which is why Christian canons include Daniel in the prophetic section of it. But the
yeah.
Hebrew Bible has Daniel outside the prophets. So that implies that the prophet section was likely complete, or at least mostly complete, before Daniel was written. And then we get after the prophets were written, it's probably when the
Mm,
writings came together.
okay.
And that's where the fuzzy edges are. That's where everything's confusing. That's
Mm,
where Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs and Esther would remain. And that's where the edges are fuzzy. And so that's where a lot of the
okay.
debate is. That's the old theory. What are your thoughts?
Um, my thoughts are they should have left an instruction manual,
It would make things a
and
lot easier.
it really would just some like cut set like guidelines and rules. But no,
Hmm.
that makes sense about the formation, the development. Like it makes sense. It would take time.
Yeah,
Like you can't just slap these things together.
right.
There was so much pain and suffering
Mm.
that went into this. And while I do think they probably endured enough in a short amount of time to create the Hebrew Bible, I do think that the art it is, it
Yeah,
it took a lot of effort and
yeah.
Yeah. So it makes
But
sense that it wouldn't be like easily cut and paste,
right,
like clearly defined.
yeah, it makes sense. But this theory has largely been abandoned by scholars. So,
Well, okay then.
as
Good. I'm so
opposed to
glad I got on board.
as opposed to there being like three sections of the Bible being put together, the Torah, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, or the Torah, the prophets, and the writing. It's like the different parts of the Bible just became authoritative as scripture at different times.
Okay.
It was much less likely for it to be like three set times, or like boom, 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 these all come together. But it likely just came together at different times. You could imagine that after the prophetic writings were written, that they
Mhm.
would quickly be seen as having special status,
Yeah.
um, especially since prophets generally were had some sort of high authority. And then
Well, yeah.
as they write something, as we learned with Elisha and the she bears, respect your prophets.
Respect your prophets. And that's what I say about Nostradamus all the time.
So after the prophetic works were written, that likely became authoritative pretty quickly.
Mm.
Uh, Likewise, a lot of the legal aspects of the Torah probably became, fairly immediate authority after it was written. And we even get the book of Deuteronomy, if
Hmm.
it is in fact the book of the law mentioned under the reign of
Yeah.
Josiah in Kings, that it would make sense that after Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic history was written, it became important, probably during the reign of Josiah, if not soon after that.
I
Um,
imagine the laws were enacted fairly quickly
yeah,
and taken seriously and
yeah,
authoritatively very quickly.
yeah.
It's the poetry that I feel like probably took time
Well,
to.
the poetry probably took time, but also if the Psalms were written for temple use, if they were written for liturgical use, as many of
Mm,
them probably were,
yeah.
and then attributing many of those Psalms to David, that probably got them to be, considered sacred and important fairly quickly
Hey,
if
do
they
you think
were used in those contexts.
did they write those about David when David was still around?
Most of them no.
Okay.
Yeah, most of them are much later, written in the style of David, written for
Mm.
David, written, on behalf of David, or written as if they were David to kind of give it that extra bit of authority.
Does that make them more or less genuine?
I mean, that's beside the point. Who cares? Who cares what genuine is? Uh, I mean, we care, but like,
We
who
care. We
cares?
care, but we have no time machine. Okay. So who made these decisions?
Yeah, yeah. It just, who makes decisions? Who's really in charge,
Who
Jody?
decides? The community. The community
The community.
decides.
There's some theories that during the Hasmonean dynasty,
Uh-huh.
they and I've only seen this being put forth by one scholar whose name I'm forgetting, Philip Davies.
Great.
Um, Kind of put forth by Philip Davies. That's like, hey, actually, the Hasmonean dynasty, which if you remember the Maccabees, like
Mm.
during that time,
Mm-hmm.
so first century BCE
Yeah.
ish, give or take, as they were in power, they're like, hey, we need to establish an official canon. So the argument goes, hey, maybe it was during that time when, like, the canonization really started taking place.
Yeah.
I don't really buy that completely. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. I think at the latest, first or middle of the second century
Yeah.
CE is when it was all put together, and it's and kind of organically, as I don't think there was like a definitive group that was like, yeah, this is the Bible now. We have the Bible. More so as books became used and other books became not used, not seen as authoritative, then that kind of helped everyone just kind of be like, yeah, yeah, these are our books, these aren't. And then you get some fringe cases that are still in the debate for a while until you get to the end of the second century.
Yeah. How long did the rabbis, well, how long does the Masoretic text document the rabbis arguing over canon? Like, at what point does it stop?
Yeah, so the Masoretic text is just our Bible, is just the Hebrew
Oh,
Bible.
sorry, the Talmud.
Talmud, yeah, no, you're good. The Talmud is a document that takes a whole bunch of arguments from a few hundred years and like the Babylonian or the Palestinian Talmud,
Mm,
it is written over a few hundred years.
mm,
And then we have sections that we often refer to, like the defiling the hand section,
mm.
has two rabbis in conversation with each other saying, no, this defiles the hands, but this doesn't. And this guy says, no, the Song of Songs, that is the holiest of holiest books. Of course it defiles the hands. But the problem is that those rabbis were not contemporary with each other. They are having this debate in the Talmud, but they lived many years apart from each other. So it's not like the Talmud presents an actual history per
Yeah,
se, but it, presents these conversations, these theologies, these debates as if they're conversing with each other. So,
interesting.
defiling the hands is probably a rather early text, but still, it's a little, it's not as if they're sitting around debating this per se. Uh,
Oh, that's boring.
I mean, like, I'm
I
sure there
wanted a
were debates,
sitcom.
but yeah, you can make a sitcom out of this still. It doesn't have to be historically accurate.
So true.
We've talked so far about the inclusion of texts, and we
Mhm.
haven't really talked about the exclusion of texts.
Because things getting left out, even if they aren't sentient, hurts my feelings for them.
Yeah, well, get ready for your feelings to be hurt because we're talking about the
Great.
Apocrypha.
Fantastic.
So, most modern Christian Bibles have the Old and New Testaments,
Yes.
and some of them have the Apocrypha in between. So, if you have your
Hmm.
SPL Study Bible, the Oxford Annotated Bible, it's going to be the Apocrypha section in between. And we've talked about the Apocrypha in our Bell and the Dragon episode. Check out episode 12 if you're interested. Whether or not that be the Bell and Dragon episode, I don't know. Check out episode 12. But
Great.
to quickly rehash that, the Apocrypha is kind of Greek for the word hidden, and they're books that Christians often regarded as authoritative. But then, the Reformation said, nah, never mind, they're not super authoritative, largely because the Jewish community doesn't consider the Apocrypha authoritative.
Yeah.
Now, Catholic and Orthodox traditions, they accept them. The Orthodox Christians accept a few more books than Catholic,
Mhm.
but for the most part, they consider those deuterocanonical, and they
Yeah.
have those alongside books in the Bible, not just separated off into their section. Or for the Orthodox isn't just separated off in their section, um,
They're
and they're
more
kind of
enmeshed.
interspersed throughout the Bible, but deuterocanonical in the sense that they are a little second tier, but still considered scripture.
Okay.
Um,
I
and they're
get
not,
that. It's like Harry Potter and then Harry Potter and the Cursed Child.
yeah, yeah, like it exists,
But
but
we don't have to
also
recognize
we
it.
don't have to talk about it.
We don't have to talk about it.
I saw The Cursed Child on Broadway.
Mm,
It was the
thoughts?
very it was the very first show I ever saw on Broadway. And I
Oh,
was like and
oh my God.
I
That's
was like
crazy.
and I was like, wow, this is like the lighting and stuff is so fun and cool and quirky, but also it was like bad writing. And I was like, is this what all Broadway's like? And then I saw Hadestown like 2 days later. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is so good.
Wow, what an epic low and then an epic high.
Yeah.
Because even reading The Cursed Child, I was like, what do you mean Cedric Diggory's a Death Eater? Spoiler
Well,
alert.
spoiler. But hey, it deserves to be spoiled because it's such a bad take. One of many bad takes by she who must not be named. But we press
Hey,
on.
we press on.
um, but yeah, so the question is, what distinguishes Apocrypha from the Jewish canon? And there's a
Mm,
few reasons.
yeah.
Primarily, their apocryphal books are relatively late. Tobit may be a little bit earlier than Daniel, but generally these apocryphal texts are from the Hellenistic period, so they are a little bit later. And then the other thing is that they're traditionally only known in Greek as opposed to Hebrew or Aramaic. Though
Okay.
again, Tobit and Sirach have recently been found in Hebrew, which if we ask the original people who composed the biblical canon if they knew that they were originally in Hebrew, would that change their mind? And our answer is we don't know because we're not ancient people.
And we don't have a time machine.
We don't have a time machine.
That will be
But
our Kickstarter.
Our
built the time
Kickstarter is a
machine.
time machine. Yeah, this should
Yes.
be real easy. But all of the apocryphal books were Jewish in origin, but only accepted by Christians, and they're completely lacking in all of the early Jewish literature lists that mention scripture. Like it's not there at all, despite Christians having no problem accepting them as scriptures. And it's not until Jerome and Augustine in the 5th century do they have like an overt discussion about the apocrypha. And even Jerome, like while he was translating them, was like, "Hey,
Mhm.
Christians, we should reject these. They're edifying, but they're not scripture." But Augustine won the argument, and then it wasn't until the Reformation where that argument opened up again. And then Martin Luther and his friends were like, "Hey, what if we got rid of Tobit?"
Wow.
I don't know why I'm picking a fight with Tobit this episode, but Tobit's my example.
I told you we all need someone to beef with. I get Josephus, you get Tobit.
Sure, sure. But then we also see how these apocryphal texts influence New Testament writers. So the Wisdom of Solomon is maybe one of the most influential apocryphal books in the New Testament, and it talks a lot about how the sin came into the world through Adam's disobedience, which is kind of the basis for Paul's argument in Romans 5 that is the basis for original sin. So the Wisdom of Solomon very clearly influenced Paul in Romans 5, which then created the doctrine of like Augustine. When Augustine did all his theological stuff, read Romans 5 was like, oh, original sin, it must be. So we have like evidence there of Paul being heavily influenced by apocryphal scripture. And then we also have Jude, who uses first Enoch, and I think we talked about this maybe in one of our Noah episodes, one of our episodes that we talked about Noah, or maybe our Sodom and Gomorrah episode. Who knows? But I think we talked about this where Jude uses Enoch. He also quotes the Assumption of Moses, which is a first century CE Jewish work that never became canon. So I think we can think of New Testament authors as having wide religious literature, but without definitive boundaries. And so some scholars will place the dating of the fixed canon in the middle of the 1st century. I think that's a little early. I agree with the majority of scholars that say mid 2nd century is safest to kind of have the defined scripture or the defined canon. So despite that, the apocryphal books are quoted less than the Hebrew scriptures, except for maybe like the Wisdom of Solomon, even though like Esther and Song of Songs aren't quoted in the New Testament. But yeah.
Sorry. I hate them being left out. I hate Esther being left out. I hate women being. Where were the women in this conversation, Matthew? Were they
They were
allowed to write
more,
or read?
not much. Hey, sexism has always been around, which is
Yeah.
not good, but it's what's happening.
But it's what's happening.
It's what's
Okay,
happening. It's the new fad, Jody.
it's the new fad. Where was this decided? Who decided it? Was it decided by the Second Temple period?
Yeah, well, I think after the Second Temple, because the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 AD, famously
Hmm.
CE. I don't know why I switched counting systems there,
Knee
but
jerk.
knee-jerk reaction. 70, it was in 70. So likely it was finally composed Second Temple Judaism, though
Okay.
I think discussions and it was like really starting to reach its final form for the most part during
Yeah.
Second Temple Judaism.
Well, because I think it's important to try to conceptualize like what conditions were they under where they were like,
Mm,
we need to decide and
yeah,
have it concrete so we can all be united. You
definitely. It
know,
definitely helps.
like what force was behind them, like really locking in and saying, this is our community, guys. This is what we follow. If we don't, they're
Mhm,
going to take us all out.
sure. Um, as for the differences between the Christian Old Testament and the Jewish Hebrew Bible,
Yeah.
we get some early references in the New Testament of the Old Testament as the law and the prophets, and
Mm.
once in Luke we get the law, prophets, and Psalms, indicating the Torah as having like the fact that the law is kind of sectioned off from the others kind of emphasizes that the Torah has some perhaps extra authority or preeminence as
Yeah.
opposed to the rest of the scriptures for Jews at least. But when the
Mm-hmm.
Christians list Old Testament, they don't really make a break between Deuteronomy and Joshua.
Yeah.
So they run together, the Pentateuch with the historical books,
Mhm.
and so sometimes they'll consider the Enneatukh, which is the 9 books. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and then Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther.
That's a new word. Spell that.
Enneatukh. Um, and then sometimes you just get the Torah and Joshua, and that's referred to as the Hexateuch. And then sometimes you get the medieval church talking about the Octateuch, which are the 8 books, Genesis through Ruth. So you get these different orderings in Christian tradition of the first few books of the Bible because
Mhm.
they don't necessarily hold the Torah in the same regard as Jewish tradition does. We can kind of separate them in different orders.
That's just kind of weird, though. Like, if I may be honest,
Uh huh.
because like one came first, it's
Mm,
included in the other.
right.
Perhaps we should look nicely upon it. Is that a
Sure.
crazy thought?
Which one came first?
The Torah over
Why?
like, well, but didn't it?
I mean,
I usually put Judaism before Christianity. I mean,
we
I could be wrong. Jesus was a Jew.
well, okay. Lots of things to talk about here. Um, First off, I think if we take Deuteronomy
Uh-huh.
as being what the book of the law as referred to by King Josiah in the book of
Mm,
Kings, if that whole the Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic history being something that came out of King Josiah's reign, I
mm.
think that would predate the completed Torah,
Okay.
the Genesis through Deuteronomy,
Okay.
for some, you know, here or there. Like, it's all intermixed. And so I think this is what I was talking about, the old theory that's not really accepted as much anymore of the Torah being written first, and the prophets, then the
Oh, yeah.
writings.
Yeah.
It's probably much more intermixed
Yeah.
and happening at different times. And we get the final version of the Torah happening contemporary or maybe even later in parts of the Deuteronomistic history.
Okay.
So it's not, and definitely parts, like the individual parts of much of the Torah predate the Deuteronomistic history,
Yeah.
but the final form as we have it for the most part today may not be so much earlier than Deuteronomistic history. And therefore, however we group these together, I don't think it's inherently obvious
Yeah.
how we group them all together. And
Okay.
therefore you can have the Pentateuch, or you can have the Hexateuch, or the Octateuch, or the Enneatukh. Now, in Jewish tradition, you can never have that because the Torah is placed on, a somewhat higher pedestal,
Yeah.
uh, somewhat speaking.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't have the Octateuch, for example,
Yeah.
in Judaism, but you could
Yeah.
in Christianity.
Okay. But my thing is, Jesus was a Jew.
Sure.
And
Okay. Um.
then should we there not therefore regard that as the thing that he followed,
Mhm.
you know,
Right. But
like and like keep it something similar? If
I
like I think I'm really stuck on the being like Jesus thing, and I'm like, well, if Jesus would have just followed the Torah and
right.
stuck with the Pentateuch.
Right. But I don't think that the canon was fixed as we say it was until after
Yes.
Jesus as
Oh,
well.
true.
And I also
Okay.
think it's a lot healthier to think of Judaism and Christianity more so as sister religions
Mm,
than parent child religions. I don't think we can see
yeah.
Judaism predating all of Christianity. I think if we follow Judaism and Christianity as
Mhm.
they grow together, I think that's a lot more healthy and reasonable way to think about those two religions.
Oh, definitely. No, no, no. Definitely healthier. You know me though. I'm a little toxic. Okay.
The other thing that Christians do with the Hebrew Bible Old Testament is they switch the order around. As it is in the Hebrew Bible, it's the law, prophets, writings. And then for the most part, Christian writings move it from history to teachings to prophets. And the prophecy moving to the end is likely significant because Christians often stress the prophetic side of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible.
Hmm.
So they even like treated non-prophetic books prophetically, like so much of the Psalms are interpreted prophetically.
Yeah.
So climaxing with the prophets treats it as kind of like a foretelling, an entry point to Jesus. And that only makes sense when you have the New Testament at the end of the prophets. But that's
Yeah.
probably why Christian orderings have the prophets at the end of the Bible instead of the writings.
Okay. Question on this because I
Hmm.
read in my research somewhere that even Jesus' reference to the last prophet was, and that was like a way to definitively tell. I think it was in that one theological
Oh,
article I sent to you. But I have a question about prophets. Is Jesus regarded as a prophet? In Christianity, also, as well as to say, I'm really not sure what he's categorized as. I've got to be completely honest.
yeah. So the book of the 12 minor prophets,
Yeah,
are usually what ends the prophetic section, whether
yeah,
that be Christianity or Judaism. The
okay,
order of those books sometimes changes, but for the most part, it ends with Malachi.
okay.
Um, I don't know off the top of my head the verse that you're referring to, but
Mhm.
if that's what Jesus was referring to when referring to the last of the prophets,
Yeah,
it wouldn't be out of the world to think that he could be referring to Malachi in either case.
I'll
Um,
find it. Then we'll do an episode on it.
Jesus in Christianity traditionally isn't interpreted as a prophet.
Okay,
A prophet usually speaks on behalf of God, and Jesus in Christianity is perceived as being
that's
part
good.
of God.
Okay,
Uh, in Islam, Jesus is considered a prophet, though.
there we go. Yeah, and that clicked in my
Um,
head. I was like, yeah,
but yeah,
he.
so we get a lot of changes in the order of the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament. And that's
Mhm,
not to say that it's always been fixed, it's always been set in stone. Much of like even if you get like the Leningrad Codex, which is the Masoretic text, and what most BHS is, which is the text that are most often used as like the base text for translating the Hebrew Bible into whatever language you want.
mhm.
Even that's going to be, particularly the writings, that's going to be in a slightly different order than most Jewish Bibles today as well. So it's not set in stone, at least for the first, the past 1,000 years, it's more so set in stone. The past few hundred years, it's more set in stone, the ordering, but that can always be a little fluctuating as well.
Okay,
I think there's a lot more to be said, but I think
probably.
we got a lot of it. As I mentioned, if you want to learn more about this, John Barton's book, History of the Bible, fantastic resource on so much more than just the canonization. There's so much more out there. This is such a fun topic. I love this. And I think one of the most common questions I get as, I have a master's degree, but as a Bible scholar is about like how these books came together.
Yeah.
And the fact that there's not an easy cut and dry answer, oh, it happened at the Council of Jamnia. Oh no, it's a lot more fluid than that. I think that's upsetting to a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
it is. Because you want me to follow this, but you can't give me any clear cut, defined details.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Okay. I don't even go to a restaurant without looking at the menu first.
Yeah, you can look at the menu. You can look at the menu of the Bible, but also recognize that there's a lot other menus out there, and it's not until certain time periods where the menus were established.
Good analogy.
These are good analogies. But yeah, any other thoughts or questions?
Um, let's see who, what, where, when. Why does it matter if things are canonized? You know why it matters.
Amazing.
Yep, I'm all
All right.
good.
Awesome. Thank you all for listening. I had fun with this conversation. If you had fun with this conversation, or if you hated this conversation, let us know on any of the social medias that we're on: TikTok, Instagram, Blue Sky. I want to be more active on Blue Sky now.
Yeah.
Reach out to us on Blue Sky. And then Spotify, YouTube, Apple Music, all of those places. We're having a blast. The Religious Treehouse. Email us at thereligioustreehouse@gmail.com. Um, and tell your local librarian about us.
Go visit your local library, check out a few books, figure out is there any community events you would enjoy? If you're like, my anxiety is too bad for community, no, it's not. Community's good for your anxiety. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye. Torpal is like crying. outside of the door. And I don't know how to tell her important things are happening in here.
Because you mentioned Josephus, and you've taught her to hate Josephus.
And she knows. She's like, Josephus is just like a golden doodle, fake as heck. Okay. Hypoallergenic.